Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to yet another space. Today, the space will focus on basically the usual approach to this war, which for now 4 years, soon it will be entering into its fifth year, has been described, vilified, and most of the time misunderstood. And the approach that I continue to say has been described as an attrition war is only entering the attrition phase of the war since about 5 to 6 months. But this year, we can see that we are into a full attrition mode. For that, I would enjoy you to go and check Oryx and start doing the balance sheet, and you're gonna understand that we are fully into a proper attrition war, which means that the losses on both sides are almost equal. Sometimes heavier for the Ukrainians, sometimes heavier for the Russians, but the momentum that Ukraine had in the first year, where it was purely defending, and the Russians weren't able to sustain their mechanized forces, and then slowly went to a completely different approach, which was Russians trying large forays with lower tier units, but on multiple shorter fronts. That too, unfortunately, failed. And then it led to a pause in 2023 when the Russians reduced their losses to a very important level, and the Ukrainians did more or less the same, despite the very poor counterattack, counteroffensive that they organized and executed in 2023. There are still some issues when it comes to the counter on the Ukrainian side, as I said, because if you base yourself on Oryx, you will not understand how the counteroffensive, but also how Bakhmut, for instance, was such a dismal failure, and at the same time, the level of proven losses are rather non-computational, with the decrease in the level of activity of the Ukrainian forces, and also the complete loss of the strategic initiative over the Donbass area, and also Zaporozhye and elsewhere. The case of this war, actually, I would have liked to make this about Kupiansk, but Kupiansk for the moment is an extreme clusterfuck, where there are two schools of thought. The first school of thought is the Ukrainian side, which has declared that Kupiansk has been cleared, that large swaths of ground on the eastern bank have been liberated. We will see later on, I really think by the end of this month and beginning of next month, that there are a lot of exaggerations, but also the push, the forces that were switched to Kupiansk in order to score that, let's say it as it is, both a tactical but also mostly a PR victory, are costing them elsewhere. And elsewhere, as I want to open up, is the Konstantinovka axis, and most importantly, the city itself. So first and foremost, Konstantinovka has always been a very poor objective to defend from the Ukrainian side, because the defense of Konstantinovka relied mostly on not losing Toretsk and not losing fully Chasov Yar and Chasov Yar Heights. From the beginning, this was a very tall order for the Ukrainians, and unfortunately, for a long while, it remained also a very tall order for the Russians. Chasov Yar resisted very strongly. The area was very complicated to do the usual infiltration and then push maneuver. But at some point in 2024, Chasov Yar stopped being this bulge. A parallel to that was also, for instance, Siversk and Belogorovka. And once that was cleaned up, the efforts of the Ukrainian side were pointed into inflicting damage and strategizing a operational blunt of the Russian push from Chasiv Yar downstairs towards Konstantinovka for so long. And it worked for a long while. Unfortunately for that, by being focused so much on that point, uh, the hyperfixation on Chasiv Yar meant that the Russians could bypass on other areas. And those other areas, well, very simple. We had Toretsk initially. Toretsk caught the Ukrainians a bit by surprise, not because it wasn't not predictable, but simply because Toretsk being a rather large agglomeration, we had this feeling that it would be a slaughter and a slugfest like Bakhmut, but it wasn't the case. Very quickly, the Russians got half of the city, then started to penetrate deeper, and then the slugfest actually started. But it looked a lot more like a suicide run from the Ukrainian side, day in, day out. And the meager results they got from the suicide runs were ultimately beaten the fuck out by the beginning of 2025, and then they dragged with a process of Turkization, which is literally rushing some people to pretend that you're still in the city, that you operationally control the city. But the reality is that those were small pockets, isolated. The only thing they could do is just delay the full cleanup of the city. Then we had a couple of also suicide runs, especially the one in June 2025, with a bunch of Bradleys, murder, etc., which ended with everybody being killed. So this approach that the Russians have employed, which is the typical infiltration approach, actually has been levied to a level on the Russian operational mentality that, in my opinion, a lot of people are speaking about this, and we can speak about Rusich, we can speak about Archangel Spetsnaz, we can also speak about some doomers like a couple of retards like Kalashnikov or Fadev, which are in this parallel reality where they pretend that the Ukrainians somehow have better artillery, have better drones, and then the reality, given the loss that we're seeing that their artillery is being called. The drone fight that for 2023 2024 was allegedly going on the Ukrainian side in 2024 at the end, and also in 2025 especially, got completely lopsided. And of course, I'm going to tell something because I love the guys, I love the unit, but the Russians are using Rubicon as a pendant to Magyar's birds between 223 and 224 in order to galvanize and make a huge black PR. Reality is that Rubicon per se is not this Deus ex machina unit. Rubicon, what did, they got the best of Sudo, best of Vipir, best of uh, Bobr. So a lot of these good operators were just pulled together, sometimes forcibly. We had the case with the guys at Moses that didn't want to join, but some of their drone pilots were poached. A lot of money was poured into the unit, a lot of assets were put into the unit, and a lot of intelligence and know-how was pulled into the unit, which allowed these guys to start standardizing and opening up technical approaches that were mostly used by SSO. And if you guys remember, on a couple of SSO clips, you could see the first AO strikes by Gerans, by Shahids, and that's where the whole, in my opinion, mistake was from the Russian side not to include a better understanding of what they were doing in overall. Because for a long while, the Russians were relying on I think we still have a problem with our friend. So, guys, welcome back. Unfortunately, as usual, we had cut off by, I don't know why it happens. There is this announcement that I'm losing the connection with internet, and unfortunately, that's not true. As you can see, I'm still online, but it sends everything to shit. So we have the situation we had where I started the space and then apparently you couldn't hear me anymore, and then we end up with the constitution. I'm gonna go back to as I said. So the space is named grind set Z. The grind set in this case is uh, actually pointing out to the triple level that we're seeing. First of all, there is unfortunately a infantry aspect of this, which is the process of infiltration that everybody now is talking about. As I said, Archangels, Fitnas, Doomers, no Doomers, doesn't matter. They're all focusing on these 2-3 man units that are trying to push through carefully pitched paths, through pipes, through underground tunnels, to whatever you want. Then there's the second part, something that we're seeing less and less, but it's still present. The second part is a foot advancement towards the next position. Usually, these are misunderstood because it's mostly advancing and clearing up positions that are not far enough. And the guys who are doing this on foot usually are also dropped not far from the objective, between 1 and 1.5 kilometers, which allows them to spread up and also be wary of FPVs coming through, because the moment they are actually getting to the position to clear it up, FPVs most of the time are also ETA, which means that the actual situation of clearing the trench is actually surviving the FPVs and then managing to clear the trench if it's possible. In multiple cases, it wasn't possible. The FPVs were not foreseen. The attacking party often gets 50% or even more sometimes casualties, and the guys who are remaining are stranded, and the guys on the trench that were supposed to be cleared actually pull out and take prisoners or clear up the stragglers on the Russian advanced party. And on the opposite, when their FPVs cannot do the job or they are not efficient enough, then the party advances, and most of the time the emplacement is cleared, and you got the scenes that we see sometimes. And a third party, this one for a long while was absolutely not present, which is mechanized assault. We're seeing it more and more now. Why? Because during the winter, uh, there is this risk reward of going mechanized, clearing up stuff, and then having a bigger presence on a specific trench network or position to take. The problem with the mechanized pushes is that the footprint is so humongous that we've seen one such position, one staging point get attacked by vampires and Baba Yagas from the Lazar unit, but we also seen Russians still managing to go deep enough and start clearing up positions and then getting attacked there too. As I said, the problem with vehicles generally, but especially armored ones, is that you attract shit like flies. And this is, as I told you in last series, that at some point the Russians looked at it and said, "Okay, listen. Let's say that you send 5 armored vehicles, 1 tank, 3 BMPs, 1 IMV. These guys are protected for a while, but once they are immobile, so there's an M kill anywhere on your grouping, then the guys are going to be sitting ducks inside the armor, or they're going to get out and they're going to get picked off." So this is the biggest problem with the armor part, is that you might survive the first wave, but it's going to be a second, a third, and a fourth. And if you're not mobile with your tank, your BMP, MV or MRAP, whatever, you're just gonna die slowly. You're gonna make nice photo shoots for Ukrainians or the Russians, depending on which side is being attacked. But there is no way to evade it, and this is one of the things that, given the presence and the long range and long endurance of these drones, takes out that notion of staying alive and being mobile. Is going to allow you to actually survive if your tank hasn't blown up right away. We've seen that with the German American tanks. It's true the tanks survive the first hits, but the problem is that they cannot move, so you need to evacuate them. And when you evacuate them, well, given that, as I said, there's this endurance, precision, and the long range of these drones, they're going to go longer, harder, and faster than you when you're on foot. And given how tanks operate or armored vehicles operate, your better or best chance is to have a trench not far or undergrowth or whatever, so you can hide somehow from this threat and then stay silent enough in order for this threat to pass, or be lucky enough for this threat not to materialize. So the drone pilot is stupid, or for some reason you can shoot it down and avoid getting hit, or at least not getting hit critically. So those three aspects that the Russians are doing, so the basic infield that now has been transformed to the only thing that the Russians do. It's stupid. The foot mobile, light skin advance that we sometimes see, including with donkeys, which of course is nonsense. Donkeys and cavalry are mostly doing logistical runs between positions, and unfortunately, this is a thing that we should never forget. The logistical interdiction between positions does exist on both sides, from the Russian side as well as from the Ukrainian side. And that's why you see on one side a lot of drones getting slaughtered on the Ukrainian side, and then sometimes horses and donkeys getting hit on the Russian side. That's not indication of a lack of equipment or a lack of vehicles. It actually is something completely different. As I said, for some units, there is this absolutely insane idea that a horse or a donkey are going to be more stealthy because yada yada. There are always these fucking ideas everywhere that unfortunately just cannot go away. And for some people, as I said, showing up with animals is some kind of stealthier, troop friendlier variant, but in reality, it's just a different way to expose yourself to a logistical failure, just as the Ukrainian drones, as we have had a discussion with multiple people, including from their own side. The problem with the NRTK, so with the unmanned ground vehicles, is that they do not go as fast, they do not carry as much, and they have huge issues with obstacle franchissement, which means that sometimes they get stuck, sometimes when they get hit, even by the slightest ordnance, you have damage, internal damage on the system, which just make them stop on the side of the road and they get picked up by a bigger drone, FPV, whatever you want. So you get a vulnerability of the system, be that a biological one, so the donkey, the horse, whatever you fucking want to call it, or a purely mechanical one, which is the UGV. So there's two aspects that we're seeing, which is a misunderstanding of the war that is being fought in Ukraine right now. And I said we are, for the first time in this war, in the process of attrition, a proper one, which is both sides are losing more or less the same thing. And it's there where the side with more assets is going to make it. And this is basically, I could stop the space here because that's where we're getting at. But of course, there are nuances, there are things that need to be said as well. But yes, this war of attrition is the worst omen that could happen to Ukraine. Because for once, the situation that the Ukrainians are having is so bad that they are forced to lie on so many aspects, but those lies just don't compute. So as I told you, we had this discussion over, oh, we're killing 30,000 per month. And the problem with the 30,000 is exactly as I told you guys. We are getting to the old discussion that we had since the start of this war when the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense started publishing these accounts of 3,000, 2,800, 500 killed or liquidated. And then that uh, guesstimation of losses at some point hit a logical hurdle, which was, okay, this is not possible. You cannot kill 1,000 guys a month and still these guys keep going. And then Ukrainians changed that. Oh, it's actually wounded and killed and whatever. And at some point, it changed back again with liquidated, killed, and so forth and so on. And then back again, we went to, oh, Zelensky himself said, oh, they have 200,000 killed and the rest are wounded. But at the same time, the losses in personnel still are shown as quote unquote liquidated, so basically killed. And we went back then with this new bullshit about 30,000 killed because it follows to the point the estimates of the Ministry of Defense, Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, which still says liquidated. So this interchangeable system, which is pure propaganda in this case, is exactly how the Ukrainians are trying to play this game, which is when you are getting fucked, pretend that you were the guy fucking. And it is there when I say I enjoin you honestly to go and check Oryx because since the start of this year, we have a very, very tragic situation for Ukrainians. And first and foremost, it is so bad that the Oryx beaches are now saying that, oh, maybe those groups and those groups could give us the footage because I'm pretty sure they have more they're not showing. We are going back to the Russian Shoigu Gunstash, where we all were like, this is not possible that Ukraine keeps going if they like there's only these kills. And as I said, on the counter, the damage done to the Ukrainian equipment were so low, and despite the fact that they were rather high, because they were compressed in about 3 and 4 months, but they were still so low compared to what the Russians were losing at the same time. It made no sense that suddenly the Ukrainians are the ones stopping the advance, unless there was something else, and that's what I was getting to at some point. There are losses that we do not see, and that are not also counted by Oryx. For instance, if you check the uh, kill shots of the Russian FPV drones in Kursk, for instance, and then you put them next to Oryx, you're going to find out that from footage to actual losses, you are barely at 60 to 65%. So it means that 35% of the image that you see an apparent hit on a vehicle, you do not have the aftermath that could prove at Oryx that you have an extra 30 or 35% or 40% of losses that are not on tape. They are seen by the drone footage, but we don't have the aftermath, which would be then counted at Oryx. Not that Oryx will always count Ukrainian losses timely, as multiple times there has been, I'd say, a influence by a third party, especially during the counter. At some point, they had between 70 and 120 vehicles that I didn't count, suddenly discovered because another poster actually found them and pointed them out. And there was this list of non-accounted for losses proven that Oyster wasn't adding. Also, as I said, and Oyster themselves, for instance, during the counter, all the hits by helicopters were not accounted for unless there was a result and a geolocation. And that's what it. So if you want to see where Oryx might have a problem, despite, on top of the fact that they are pro-Ukrainian, you also have their own uh, cooking rules or cooking book, which is most of the time extremely complicated to understand by their own values. But in any case, if you go now, you're going to see the funny things happening. Ukraine side when it comes to losses, and as I said, it is so bad that there is this frenzy to find a justification on why suddenly you have this problem. However, the problem is well easier to understand. Recently, there was this publication by a FPV operator or drone operator on the Ukrainian side who has been joined by the SBB or SBS, depending on how you want to call it, which was the unmanned troops of Ukraine under the command of Gedyar. And he was talking about how kills are inflated, losses are just uncounted, and mostly there is no logic of employment because the whole principle that I already explained before that rests on the gamification of the kill chain on Brave One had many flaws, and those flaws is that first of all the point system would devoid the operational planning of its actual value. Why? I'm going to tell you, as I told you last time, the fact that you want to kill things and get points for it would make you go to kill. So everybody's going to score the sectors to find something to fly FPV drone at. The problem is that by doing so, you disperse the effort because everybody wants to score. It's a competition. Unfortunately, you had a unit hiatus, which is Gedia had the most assets, and also they would claim themselves to count because there they were the top dogs to do the counting. The unit under the commander, which also was the head honcho of the whole fucking cabal, meant that they were going to be first anyway. And reading that article from that UI drone operator, you understand that the inflation is logical because we are into a warlord instance. Madjar honestly has become a full-fledged warlord due to the fact that he's deciding a lot of strikes, be that long-range strikes, be that operational or tactical LOC strikes and stuff like that. And when you read to that, you also understand that, as I said, by trying to gamify it, by trying to let everybody get the shots, you are losing sight of the objective. And that's what was also transpiring by the fucking article. Where the Russians have more assets, they are also more focused because, once again, the Russians understood one thing. They cannot stop Ukraine from getting resupplied. The deterrence doesn't work, and on top of it, NATO and the US have decided they want to play that game. So unfortunately, unless you want to nuke the US, which is not going to happen, you'll have to fight a proxy war with the Ukrainians. And as I said, you're going to have your losses, but you're also going to genocide Mikola and Taras and Tatiana. So the problem that we're seeing is that once, as I said, that the Russians cannot solve the main issue, which is the supply lines, because too far, there's no control over the borders, stuff like that, they're going to just, as I said, take care of the logistical routes. And logistical routes, I did a thread over that in September 2025. Russians identified four main logistical routes going south, South Donetsk, Donetsk Center, and Donetsk North. Those four routes were all tributary to two things. First of all, there was Pokrovsk, and second of all, there was Dushkovka and Dobropila to Dushkovka. That situation was attacked by the Russians finally in 2025. So, first and foremost, there was the Pokrovsk siege, and the second part was the Dobropila attempt north of Pokrovsk in order to also avoid a bypass that would then help defend the sister cities within Donetsk. The Sumy slash Kharkov situation is a completely different road, which would require a ad hoc task force and an intervention from the north to cut the area. This intervention has started in earnest in May 2024. As I said, initially I hoped it wouldn't be a tactical decision, but it was a debate, it was a tactical decision, and that grind actually is the second part of this space, is also paying dividends. But right now, Ukrainians are not feeling it, although Cope State started to squeal yesterday by saying, oh, Rubicon is back in Vovchansk, they are completely fucking us up. But as usual, Deep State is not going to say why that is being done. This is something we're going to discuss just after finishing with Konstantinovka. So, by having this huge problem, as I said, by having no brain behind the game console, because that's how the Ukrainians are using the drones. For them, it's like some kind of video game, but with people dying at the end. The Ukrainians are losing focus mostly because they're going too far in way too many directions, and as I said, they are paying off the kill chain. Then you get nepotism, then you get corruption, then you got preferential treatment, all that shit. But that's something that we do not need to concern ourselves with. What we need to concern ourselves with is why Konstantinovka is going the way it is going. As I said, the bulwark to defend Konstantinovka was Chasov Yar. Chasov was lost somewhere around the end of 2024. It was completely lost operationally, and then by 2025, it was cleared up. Where we have the situation right now, where some Ukrainians attempt to infiltrate, but mostly the area is gone for them. And then you have the advances north of Chasov Yar in Markovo, which threatens to make a larger link up north. And of course, we have the Russians in Ilinivka since probably a couple of days, which means that towards Konstantinovka, the entry line to the city is going to be the highway cutting the city in two on its horizontal layer. So the problem they're going to have once the Russians start fighting from the highway line means that they have the widest sector of infiltration, penetration, assault, call it whatever the fuck you want. And that means they're going to spill on the side. And recently, we had this video of SSO trying to reanimate a dying pigger that was most probably attacked from the west of Konstantinovka. There was also later on a UMPK falling into a high rise that was supposed to be a hiding place for Ukrops. And this once again shows, as I said, the problem is that Russians tactically have perfected an exploitation form of combat. So when they infiltrate a couple of guys, everybody's gonna say, yeah, two or three, they stay there, they wait until more people are coming. No, what we saw with Pokrovsk, for instance, you got smaller groups that are actually marauding along the entry points up north, killing Ukrainians, and then just wandering around the city until they get caught by FPVs, by the Ukrainians, whatever you want. This creates an uncertainty and a beaten area within the city, something unfortunately very reminiscent to what Voksha was doing. So basically, Wagner was doing, especially in Soledar and then in Bahmut. But back then it was Zex. Now we have contract soldiers who are mostly not Zex. And most importantly, this has gotten the loss of equipment to go lower, but also losses in men, despite whatever is being said, not moving that much, because what's going on is that you try with a smaller group of people, first gonna fail, second gonna fail, third gonna fail, fifth gonna fail, and then the sixth gonna work. But once you open up with that sixth one, not only you're gonna reap a lot of benefits. First of all, I said you're gonna create this very difficult area of contraption and of control on the Ukrainian side. They are not going to know who is where and what needs to be done. And therefore, and this is the part when it gets extremely difficult, um, they are going to start moving out from the areas they suspect being infiltrated by the Russians. And this bubble will allow other Russians to infiltrate and then expand, expand, expand. At the end, suddenly you lost Pokrovsk. Suddenly you lost Konstantinovka. Suddenly you lost Siversk. Suddenly you lost Ulyapolye. Suddenly you lost Verkhokamyansk. Suddenly you're going to lose other places like this. And this, of course, all of this comes from three things. First of all, the grind set, which is led by drones. The Russians finally are grinding positions by UMPKs, by Monias, whatever you want, but most importantly by drones. Uh, Once they sense, detect, or confirm the presence of piggers somewhere, they're going to start harassing it. And after the unmanned harassment, you're going to have the manned harassment. And after the manned harassment and the clearance, you're going to have a push forward. And then for the next step, UMPKs, attempted mechanical push, and then finally we get to the FPV role, and then finally the foot mobile attempt to clear up trenches or penetrate a perimeter or a city, whatever you want to fucking call it. This grind set is costing people, and there is what I said, that for the Russians the war went beyond the operational masterpiece, whatever the fuck they think they were doing, to basically a result oriented fight, which means that they became far more cynical. And once they are far more cynical, we are in a situation where losses are a fact of life. And what needs to be lost more than anything else is people who will sustain the momentum. So unfortunately, you're gonna have people who are less interesting for the Russian military. So foreigners, for instance, Zex, units that have other issues. This cynical approach, this uncallous approach, is problematic, but at the same time, it allows the Russians to keep this ongoing, non-stop approach when it comes to infiltration or when it comes to foot mobile assault, which means that Ukrainians just do not have enough manpower at the line, even if the unit is full, to parry it. But on top of it, seeing them, as I said, coming time after time, just makes it futile. So you have a mechanism, a mental mechanism that is breaking on the Ukrainian side. We just kill, I don't know, 10 of them, and there are 10 others coming every time. What the fuck is going on? But on top of it, once those guys pass, the domino effect with the other defensive positions is almost automatic, which means that the losses that they incurred initially, they are recovering by clubbing them out of their fucking trenches. And this is the biggest problem that we have with the Russian approach, is that it's true that we are in attrition war, as I said, a proper one, which means comparable losses, stuff like that. But at the same time, the attrition war makes it also very complicated for both sides to actually stop the way they are operating. The Russians cannot give a pause to the Ukrainians, because we saw that once you start posing a certain area of the front, they're gonna start reacting. It's not always gonna be perfect. They're not suddenly going to roll you back to I don't know where. But they will pose situations like Kupiansk, for instance, where a lot of things were thought to be on the cusp of success, and then you have the shit show you have right now. Same thing for Toretsk, for instance, as I said. Toretsk was operationally taken, but still Ukrainians were breeding in some cellars and shit like that. So, the grind set that we're talking about right now is not only, as I said, just clear out the enemy, it's also make sure that the process in which you are clearing them out and advancing is a process that is not a pure loss. And sometimes it's true that it feels like madness because you're going to send troops to assault a position. But at the same time, the fact that these troops are going to assault a position are also bait for the opposite drone ops that need to fly these FPs at some point. These flying points get detected, and you have a not so funny surprise for them. And once again, I want to shoulder this by both the Cope State article over Volchansk, but also what we have been hearing by other people within the Ukrainian military. And the latest article I said that is being extremely heavy on Magyar gives a hint on how the Russians are advancing like that. Now, where the grind set is going to have a limit, it's not that much how many people are going to be lost a month, a year, a week. It's not that. The grind set is going to have an issue because the type of understanding and the type of planification that leads at some point is going to give you, if you are the Ukrainian military leadership, hints of where it's going. So on one side, I don't want to make it sound that they are that stupid that they don't see where the Russians are going with this. As I said to you, if a bunch of autists on Twitter analyze quickly and point out that, okay, they are trying to take out the inroads for logistics, of course, Ukrainians are going to understand the same way. But where the situations are going to get out of hand, especially with the tactical operational approach. And this is something that I still don't get why the Ukrainians, for some reason, do not attempt to put a spanner on this mechanism. And if you go back to this article that is going after Magyar, it said, like, we're losing at the zero because we're not attacking their deep logistics. The problem with that is the same. Why is that happening? Of course, this is if we believe 100% the situation. Why is that happening? Why suddenly the Ukrainians are so stupid that they don't do, for instance, something like Rubicon is doing? Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, my understanding is that the Russians are putting the pressure all over the line, which means that by having that many holes to plug for Magyar, they're going to have some that's going to go missing. But where it gets worse is that I think that the approach that the Ukrainians are having, because it's some kind of artisanal approach when it comes to the kill chain and so forth, means that they are a lot more at ease by plugging smaller holes because you can do it faster in a certain sense. If it's only like 10, 15 vehicles per week going through, killing them and piling up on the roadside is going to take a bit of time, but is going to put a lot more stress to the unit on the area. The problem is that if you start pulling a lot of other groups to block a Pokrovsk artery, for instance, which is hundreds of vehicles per day, let alone per week, then the risk, as I said, is that you will have to have a larger pool, a bigger footprint, and with that bigger footprint, you're going to get an AMPK on the S, or Rubicon's going to come and rape your face. So this is the thing that, in my opinion, we're seeing the Ukrainians go small because they do not want to risk what I think has happened along 2025 when they pulled bigger FPV drone teams. They got sniffed out by the Russians. They got bombed. And that's why for a while in September 2025, we have a string of losses on drone operators. And most probably they fell to UMPKs or Iskanders or whatever you want to call it. So once again, the problem that seems to be happening with the Ukrainian forces is, as I said, first of all, there's the UAV forces are too spread because they want their kill score to go up. This leads also, as we read on the article, multiple teams going after the same targets, which is completely superfluous, redundant, it's just lost equipment. But most importantly is the Ukrainians themselves cannot stop. They cannot stop, for instance, harassing the Russians. They try to keep every road as dangerous as possible because the moment the Russians are going to have a couple of days off with minimal danger, they're going to pile up enough troops to get a bigger push. And once again, we're thinking about the screen at Dobropila. That's the kind of results you might get if you stop for a couple of days to restock whatever you want. Now, the situation, once you start looking at this the way I'm looking at it, is that, as I said, we are in the war is being now channeled into a very specific way out. As I said, you're gonna have a junction between the effort coming from Gulapolye and the effort coming from Steptogorsk, Lukanivka, and then Komishuvaka. They're gonna join somewhere over Orikiv, and this means that suddenly the Ukrainians are 25, 30 kilometers up north, which means that the territory that the Russians want to get in Zaporozhye would be mostly captured. Unfortunately, there is Zaporozhye city, and also there's a speck of oblast on the other side of the Dnieper, which the Russians would have huge issues crossing. And then, as I said, on the other side, well, you're going to have a different profile, but this, at the same level, we're at the same logic, which is those four roads that we had initially, that the Russians now are attacking, we are now down to two roads because Pokrovsk fell. And so one road is a shorter inroad straight from Zaporozhye directed to Orikiv. The second road, well, now that you don't have Pokrovsk, you need to bypass Dobropila, but Dobropila itself was threatened by the Russians. They are not too far. And therefore, the movement of Dobropila-Drushkovka now is being threatened to the point when we're going to have exactly what, once again, I said, a advancement that would come on a different proposition. And this advancement, as I said, would be a push probably from Liman in order to shake the Ukrainians and make them choose which side of the river they want to get fucked. In short, the Russians now have so many options on so many fronts that it makes no sense for anybody to think that it's going to change. So once Konstantinovka is taken, it's logical. Next one is Drushkovka, and then you got Slavyansk Amatorsk because it's literally the path toward the sister cities. But Konstantinovka itself doesn't bring much, I'd say, except some morale boost. But it also opens up on both sides towards Slavyansk coming from Siversk, and of course Drushkovka, and then again Slavyansk coming from Drushkovka. These are not short-term processes, the way I see it is that Konstantinovka is not going to fall properly, which means that operationally before the month of May. Now, after that, what's going to happen is that you're going to have another 1 or 2 months when the Ukrainians are going to try and do another Toretsk, because Konstantinovka, the city is rather large and then it's on the low ground. But the other problem within the Ukrainian leadership is that they too, most of them probably, are thinking about breaking the Zugzwang they're having right now. And unfortunately for them, the only way to break it properly would be a Western intervention, which means an American intervention. Nobody's really sure about this situation. Everybody's scared to fucking death. And this is why we're having Zelia literally looking like he got beaten his shit to the pulp by his wife, and he then dares to lecture the Europeans over, oh yeah, Greenland is not that important, but we can, like, we were entering in such a complete lunacy over Greenland, but that betrays a big stress on Zelia's part, because he knows that the way the war is going is a trajectory to total whole death. And that's the problem that Zelensky understands. He's not that stupid. He understands exactly where they're going. And where they're going is the following. First of all, they're going towards a lack of money. Second of all, they are also going towards the lack of men. They already are for a part, but they are going there. And then the fourth situation is that none of the Ukrainian approach, defensively, offensively, makes sense. And again, I'm going to go to the article that says, okay, there's almost nothing being done to the enemy's logistics 5, 10, 15 kilometers deep. The thing is, there is something being done because you have losses of Gruzoviks and Buhankas and whatnot. The problem is that those are last mile deliveries. Those are not the core deliveries of equipment to a staging point and then distribution. And it's there when you understand why things happen and why Ukraine is not able to replicate those things that are happening on the Russian side. First and foremost is that Russia has its own money, so they can allocate it the way they want. There is no delay like for Ukraine when they need to think everything 10,000 times until the draft is approved, and then after the draft actually passed to law or whatever. So the core misunderstanding from the Ukrainian side, and I'm saying this while I hate them. I'm speaking about the high command of the Ukrainian army. I literally, like, I cannot see how much more retarded you need to be. But in this case, it's a bit more different in the sense that what I feel with the Ukrainian side, especially now that Budanov was meant, who took the place of Yermak, what I'm feeling with the Crops is that they do not want to change the modus operandi, which is 80% PR, 20% effect. And they don't want to change it, I suspect, because the propaganda effect is not anymore only for the foreign audience, but now it has passed into the local audience. Why? Because it's extremely simple. Having images to show everybody you're killing Katsap is so much better than having to explain that. Why the fuck suddenly on Oryx you are losing 65 tanks and the Russian 38? Not 65 tanks, but 65 vehicles or assets and so forth. So, but still, the point is the same. If you keep showing bullshit and say, "Oh, we killed 5,300 Katsaps this week," Of course, people are going to start forgetting that at the same time, what Kassabs are showing is they're getting raped twice as much. And I go back to the article when they clearly say, yeah, it's not very funny what's happening to our asses. And our asses are on fire right now. And they are on fire mostly because there are some Kassabs in some fucking drone unit that are raping our asses. Not complicated, very simple. The best thing that could happen to the Ukrainian drone forces, I'm going to repeat, is to actually end the war. Because they can find a lot of jobs elsewhere. But right now, for as long as the war keeps going, and given that they do not seem to have a leadership that cares about their well-being, they're going to get targeted to a point where there will not be any way back. And this is exactly why things are so complicated for Ukrainians right now. They are complicated because nobody's helping them out with this war. A lot of people are discussing about how Ukrainians are in advance, how Ukrainians are going to show the Europeans this and that. That's one of the problems. Given that the Ukrainians have started their own type of warfare in this war, in order to palliate for the lack of bodies and the lack of equipment, and also a lack of fire superiority when they needed it, well, they also have their own way of dealing with shit. And of course, a lot of equipment is coming from China, from the US, whatever. But it's the way the Ukrainians wage the war that makes it so complicated for everyone else to help them, except giving them money. The problem with the money is that it needs to buy something, and the Europeans are not letting go of this principle, which is an offset. So if we give you money, you buy in Europe. The whole 90 billion deal is exactly that. But by doing that, you stifle both the quantity of shit that Ukrainians can churn out, but also the quality of it. Because we can talk as much as we want about superior Western shit, whatever, but the quality level that one needs to have to bomb Katsaps, to paraphrase the Ukrainians, has nothing to do, I'm going to repeat, has nothing to do with how you should actually look at things. When you see the Russians being mocked for the UNPK welding faults, now nobody laughs about that. And it's the same thing, the same problem that we're seeing with the Ukrainians. The biggest issue that nobody wants to talk about, I'm going to repeat, is that we are into a process, a principle that sees everybody misunderstand the core point. And the core point is that the Ukrainians need right now is as much as they can, as many as they can, as far as they can. And this thing is still not there. And if you want to understand that, simply look at the grants. If you start looking at the board numbers, it's true that these guys are sending probably somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 grants a year, while having a completely different system, a larger system, a larger strike force. Ukrainians are somewhere around 30,000 loot and all shit cobbled together. We're speaking about large one-way attack drones. We're not speaking about everything else. So once you start making the analyze, you also understand that you need explosive for that. And I did it fairly quickly. For those 60,000, 70,000 grants, you need between 3.6 and 4,000 tons of explosive, which is quite a lot. And when you see the scale of production globally, it's obvious that it doesn't matter how much you're gonna fucking pretend. You just do not have the equipment, the raw materials to actually have that many drones that you would like to have and send to the Russians. And this is both a market issue but also a cost issue. You are just being sustained, supported, and prepped up by people who are way too expensive. And therefore, when they give you 90 billion, but you buy shit at their place, and it's inflated by a factor of three, well, the Russians, okay, some things they do in house, which is a completely different approach, but something they want to go to China, and of course, is it shitty? Is it going to be failing right away? Nobody gives a fuck because it just needs to fly far enough to the point and blow you up. On top of the fact, it's not shitty. It's good enough. It's good equipment for the use that you're going to make. And on top of it is 1/3 of the price you're paying with Europeans. So these things that I already spoke about, that the team has already pointed out, they remain constant, and this is what is handicapping the Ukrainians. And here you can see it's just not their high command having an issue. It's the whole gamut. They have way too expensive friends. They have way too needy friends because I give you money, you need to buy that me. So this offset, forced offset, makes it extremely complicated for the Ukrainians to actually do anything about it. And it also facilitates theft and embezzlement because, okay, you get money from the EU, you have a contract with a German company, a French company, doesn't matter. This guy goes, you know what, underwrite something. And then you have the other situation, like for the Helsing drones that apparently are not good enough. But meanwhile, the procurement contracts have been signed and these drones are being made and the money has been paid or keep being paid. And then you get to the point that I told you, which is the moment you have these structural issues of too expensive, too clingy friends, smaller manpower pool, smaller labor pool, a less deep entry in the market, for instance, for explosives, for raw materials, stuff like that. Meanwhile, the Russians not only produce them themselves, but also can go straight to China. And it's true that recently we've had, oh yeah, the Ukrainians are being hidden so that the Russians go out, the Ukrainians go in. For sure that a lot of things are going to be bought, but we can see by the optical fiber level delivered from China to Russia, from servos, from LT engines, and so forth, so on. It's not comparable. The Russians are buying 5 times as much for certain items. So the cope about, oh, China sells to both, yes, but not in the same volumes. And once again, this doesn't mean that the Chinese see the Russians as friends. It's just, as I said, their bet that it's better for the Russians to go to the finish or even straight up win, because it would force Europe to start dealing with Russia in a different way. And I think it's a Chinese hope that this will either reshuffle Europe into a more authoritarian state, which means that a lot of the things that still make Europe agreeable for many things and also a potential competitor to China get stifled, and Europe simply becomes a arthritic ball of shit while the Chinese advance and the Americans advance whatever we want. Or, as I said, the Europeans actually shit themselves in the pants and then accept stuff that for now 30 something years I said that was never going to happen. And this means that they start to break, and then of course they start opening up to the Chinese because they say, okay, we are in the world that we do not control anymore. So it's better to actually start looking for alliances or at least for partnerships that would not cost us our strategic action initiative, which right now the Europeans do not have because America is the big boss within NATO. So structurally, America still has the contact key on the European car, figuratively speaking. But this, of course, has a cost that almost nobody can pay. And it's extremely complicated for me to describe it differently than there is no way for Europe to accept a lot of things. There is also no way for Ukraine to wage this war differently, simply because at the same time Ukraine, by this dronification of its economy, is surviving economically. The money with the assembly and so forth and so on allows them to keep some people working that otherwise would either have to go to the military or would leave the fucking country. So there is a economical deal within the problems, or at least the way Ukraine is waging war, which means that Ukraine changing this without an actual direct impact. So right off the bat, they liberate half of the fucking Russian controlled territory. They are just going to make more and more mistakes and self-delete themselves. And this is why it's so complicated for both sides to actually try and find a different way of combat right now. Both the Russians with their infiltrations, the drone harassment, and so forth and so on, and Ukrainians with their defense, their piecemeal defense, manpower-wise, and the drone wall, and all the shenanigans that we're seeing. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, as I said, we are seeing a war that, in my opinion, is very difficult to replicate. Except, as I said, if for some reason the Americans are stupid enough and try to fight off China somewhere within the Asian continent instead of on the island of Formosa, Taiwan, whatever you want to call it, simply because, well, first of all, it's too far, so it's going to be a mostly amphibious operation or a bombing operation or whatever you want. But most importantly is that um, there is a huge misunderstanding, as I said, to how this war is operating and why is it operating like that. As I said, a lot of people, there was analysis on how the Russians were behaving within the drone warfare that we're seeing. Well, that analysis is moot. It doesn't matter how the Russians are doing well or not well. The problem is that Ukrainians keep having drones. We're going to have the whole Starship Trooper meme. The best way for not getting droned is to cut the hand before it grabs the operating commands, or there is no drone to fly. So they're starved, but at a macro level. So basically, you have a blockade. Nobody gives them money. Nobody gives them drones. But by the moment you have installed this, it doesn't matter how well you're gonna perform under drone attack, because you're gonna have another one, another one. You're guaranteed to have a saturation, and therefore some tactical advances, some tactical understanding is important, but it's not beating the fact that Ukraine receives a shit ton of drones, money, and so forth and so on. It's just making the expenditure of those drones a bit more important. But at the end, they'll get you. So the only way to solve the situation is, once again, that the situation just doesn't appear because they don't have the money to wage this war. And of course, then after not having the money being blockaded comes not having the bodies. Because right now it's true that don't have the bodies for specific tasks, but at the same time, it is an issue. And Ukraine not having enough bodies and trying to replace this lack of bodies by the drones, as I said, is just going to make it a far more risky defensive proposal. We saw that with Gulia Polio, we saw that Siversky, and so forth and so on. if your drone misses, if at one point you're stuck or you cannot see anything, you cannot act because there's quote unquote nobody to defend it physically there. And therefore, the problem, as I said once again, is that you enter into this self set up trap on the Ukrainian side, especially on the Western side, where you think that what you're seeing is what you're going to get later on at a later date. But at the same time, you're seeing this because of a context that is going to disappear. So once again, a AU intervention in Ukraine is not going to have a problem for the Russians drone-wise. You're going to have a problem for the incoming European troops to sustain the Ukrainians who have never been under drone attack. And it doesn't matter how much you're going to simulate it. Getting blown up by a drone is the realest thing you're going to have. And because of drone warfare is the way it is right now, you have a high, very high percentage of chance to get absolutely killed or wounded to a point when you're useless, you're a sack of shit. And this is what we're seeing in Ukraine right now. We're seeing that the biggest problem for the battlefield is not that much the drone itself. The drone is the articulation of the combat method. But the biggest problem is that after that drone, there's another, there's another. So is the multiplication, is the support, is the sustainment of this program, is the money, is the raw materials, is the parts. In short, it's the logistics stupid and the political lack of alternative to cutting them. So if you cannot stop the logistics from coming in, you should make it more complicated for them to get to where they are needed. And this is why the roads are being attacked. This is why it has become a logistical attrition game now for 2-3 days. When it comes to the longer time, because finally, a couple of years, really 2-3 days into a strategical point of view. But the most important part is that, as I said, once this war is over, the conditions in which this war is being fought are rarely, in my opinion, going to represent themselves. So a lot of things that is being learned here, in my opinion, should be understood, filleted, and then try to be put into action or integrated into a different approach to warfare. So this is one thing that we're seeing with the Americans is that they are insisting on swarms over equipment and vehicles and automated swarms. So basically just launch them and you go straight to the attack. This is one of those things. You don't need drone operated or 10 drone operators, 100 drone operators to actually be behind the drone. If there is quote unquote AI or auto targeting system, even if it's not perfect, but out of the 10 FPV swarm, 5 strike, but you don't need to care about it. They are all fire and forget or launch and forget. This is what I think is going to happen. That should happen as a lesson out of the Ukrainian-Russian drone war. But the problem that I'm feeling on the Ukrainian side is that, as I said, they do not have any other option than to go with the drone war. The drone war is not working against the Russian superiority in means, and therefore, this is what I was getting to. This is the problem that you have as Ukraine. We're trying our best, it's not working. So the only thing we can do is just hope for the best and add a layer more bullshit. And there comes the new Minister of Defense. Oh, we're killing 30,000, we need to kill 50,000. I'm like, nigga, what the fuck is even this? Why are you going with this communist bullshit slogan? you would think this is we should fight to surpass the plan set by the party. Like, there is no logic when you start announcing this shit. You are just opening your mouth to yap, and that's it. At the same time, you got Rubicon Ziggers raping your motherfucking helicopters 300 kilometers away. And of course, it's not Crimea when you fucking gonna stop your boats 20 kilometers from the coast and attack a airfield that's literally on the coastline. No, it's flying all over your shit and taking you out when the least you expect them, in this case in Krovograd. It is there when you see that the war is going to that attrition level. That is extremely frightening. I'm going to repeat, it's extremely frightening for Ukraine. Because that was their trump card. The trump card was literally drones, long-range drones, facility to actually use them and complement them with normal artillery, tanks, and so forth. Now your problem is that Rusnia not only has caught up, but now is begging you so hard that you're feeling it. Because I'm going to repeat, Russians losing one or two helicopters is not a problem because Ulan-Ude is still working. Ukrainians losing Mi-24s is going to be a lot more hard to replace because the stocks out there are very limited and not everybody wants to let them go. And then what? You're going to have Apaches or Cobras? No issue. They're still going to get blown the same way. The quasi-transparency of the battlefield, the overall control by ISR from friends, own ISR, Russian from friends, or both ISR for Ukraine, you are into a global quasi-transparent battlefield where the only thing saving you is just there is a juicier target next to you or a bit further. In this case, those air grants could have been used for a substation or a accumulation of troops somewhere. No, they went for helicopters because that was the target. That was what they wanted to shoot down. And it's going to be the same time every time. Ukrainians are going to get stuck into their we need to kill more Russians, and the Russians are going to continue with we need to absolutely make it impossible for them to have equipment, supplies, so forth and so on specific point on the log. And then at the end of the day, what is going to happen, what happened with so many other places, Ukrainians are going to get starved, they're going to pull back, you're going to start infiltrating, and then completely getting over the whole perimeter that you're aiming at. Let the Ukrainians try and get it back, and bis repetita, rinse and repeat, and finally you are at the entrance of Kramatorsk. And then what the fuck are you going to do? If you're Ukraine, when you see the Russians besieging Kramatorsk, if we have to believe Zelensky, you're going to suicide. If you have to believe Monkey, they're going to start discussing because they don't want to get kicked out. Once they get kicked out, there are no more negotiations. You need a complete set of rules. You never agreed to anything as Ukrainian. But suddenly you got kicked out of Donbass, and then they are advancing Zaporozhye, they are advancing in Dnipropetrovsk. Who said they're going to stop? The only way to make them stop was to sit on the table and accept that you're going to lose 4 oblasts, and that's it. Plus the army, plus whatever. But you refuse to do that. So now you're going to have a more expensive deal. This is the other aspect of the grand set. A lot of people are mocking the negotiations because at the end of the time, negotiations so far have been stalling and baiting. There has been the stalling on the Russian side to allow them to continue the war, and you have debating from the Ukrainian side. Oh yeah, we absolutely agree to the peace proposal. You read the peace proposal, it's absolutely not what was proposed initially. We made some changes. So basically, you didn't agree to the peace proposal. You just like started to run your mouth off. So once again, I'm going to go back to what I said. Biggest issue we're gonna have generally, is that um, by refusing to accept the inevitable, the Ukrainians are just going to get a more expensive deal later on, which, with time going, will limit their options, in my opinion, to buffer zones. Their best option would be to have the smallest buffer zone on Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, for instance, and the smaller buffer zone past Zaporozhye. So, what exactly do you want from the Russians? They made a proposal, you refused it, they won the war, so what the fuck are you gonna do? So, those issues that Ukrainians had, as I said, on the military side, are doubled up by the absolute stubbornness on the political side. And the way that the Russians are waging this war and fighting it contributes to exactly this. Because it's going slow, but has taken a shape and direction, Ukrainians think they have time. And they can sell that, oh, see, we're resisting. And I'm like, yeah, for sure, you're resisting. I can show you plenty of life hazard houses. They are still more or less standing, but nobody wants to live in there. Ukraine is different. The houses have collapsed, but no problem. You're gonna stay there, and you're gonna freeze to death or whatever. It doesn't fucking matter. And this is the beauty of this war. Um, it has completely uh, turned upside down the calculus of defeat, because people are paying the bills and people are, churning out equipment and raw materials and bombs and shit for Ukraine, despite the fact that by now the Ukrainians are on a fully net loss path. The more this gets on, the less people are susceptible to come back. So up until now, it was 2.9 million is going to stay abroad. I do not believe that. If the war keeps going another year and people are starting to gang press guys back to the military, you're just going to have more and more people just fleeing or deserting or whatever, and just not coming back, because the moment they flee and they go abroad, they are still criminally liable for that. So for sure, they're not going back to fucking Ukraine. They're gonna fucking find whatever they want, but they're not going back to Ukraine unless the government changes, there's amnesty and whatever. But this is, once again, I'm gonna repeat, this is the problem that Ukraine has had since the beginning, and for 4 years, it has been just like thoughts and prayers for those problems. And yes, we can say they were a smaller party, they were under attack, whatever. But still, there are things that they are announcing, and we know they're false, because then we see the troops, and then we see the ground verdict. So, to recap the whole thing, Russians are applying specific tactics that are all depending on the fact that the drone warfare that used to be like more positive Ukrainians has completely switched. And I pointed out the complaints from the Ukrainian side. Second, because of the drone warfare and some of the issues that we're seeing and the byproducts of it, like the artillery calling, the equipment calling, Ukrainians now stay a lot further on the back, which means that that gray zone that is beaten by the FPVs, if, and I'm going to repeat what I said in September, if that place is crossed and the Russians are breaching, then they start to create, as I said, this air bubble, and the Ukrainians, because they are not numerous enough, they start panicking, pulling back, and then in order to stop that, they need to divert troops somewhere else in mass and then get them in, which then is going to cause what happened with Pokrovsk, Toretsky, the slow destruction of the city, because the more you're going to put there, the more the Russians are going to hit you, and the casualties are going to start mounting. We all remember Black Hawk Down. Well, that's the thing. There was no reason to send those 11 guys at the entry of Pokrovsk and then see them completely get wrecked by FPVs. Zero. And that's why we're having this situation, as I said to you guys. The grind set is real, it's not funny, but it has left a trace, it has left a path. And this path, the more we're looking at, the more it is obvious that Ukrainians, first, they're not going to win the war within the current set of data, but most importantly, they are sleepwalking to a defeat they could have avoided even last year in November. And the problem that's going to happen with the Ukrainian defeat, if it's a military defeat which is going to push not a capitulation but a withdrawal order, a ceasefire, and so forth and so on, that thing is going to absolutely destroy politically Ukraine. Because if we enter to the area where it's the 7th, 8th year, Zelensky is still in power. But at that point, they are exhausted. They need to sign, as I said, a ceasefire and a pull-out document. Then you can imagine what's going to happen with Ukraine. The political turmoil would be so important that you don't even need to keep going with the war, because the Ukrainians would have done that to themselves. And you can also feel the issues that they have with corruption and the iniquity of mobilization, who gets to get killed and who gets to stay alive, even the people who are actually mobilized. So, yeah, that's the thing that we're having, and that's why Konstantinovka is falling, is that there is no real plan on how to contain Russian infiltration, because there is not enough manpower, because there's not enough manpower, there's not enough people to actually fly drones when they need it, and because the Russians are flying almost the same, the drone exchange leaves both sides depleted. The first line of defense and the first line of attack. It's very obvious where this is going. The only situation I said is that, would it be worth anything? But because we're talking about territories, not people, it is worth every kind of effort for as long as it's done. And there we are. We're also done with this space. I know it was a bit ramblish, a bit ranty, but I just wanted to point out that, one, we're in a real attrition war, and that attrition war is showing results on different layers of the front, despite the fact that a lot of people are mocking by saying, oh, it's microscopic. Yeah, that's the problem. Those microscopic losses are still counting, and the level of terrain gained by the Russians between January last year and January this year is sensibly the same, which could also show that the Russians have peaked operationally per month. So basically, they're going to be at around 500 square kilometers generally a month, if there is nothing stupid that happens, like Ukrainians try to do something in Chernigov or Kursk, whatever. So, this is what I want to finish with, is that it doesn't actually really matter what you think about how both sides are fighting. What matters is how much these two sides can change the way they're fighting. And so far, the side who has the most to win by keeping the same way of fighting, unfortunately for Ukraine, are the Russians. Because they're extolling the same type of losses in equipment and in men. And they're pushing forward. It is slow, it is small, but they're still going forward. And it is there when you have nothing to compare with World War One. Because in World War One, you have sometimes these huge pushes that got stolen and brought back. Here, it's not like that. It's a small advancement every single day. And then suddenly, for the type of forces that are employed, because we are not speaking about million men into armies, we are like with a front line between 200,000 and 300,000 people. And that's it. That's the beauty of it. It is maybe for this that Ukraine now is trying to have these nonsensical peace deals, and why everybody now is trying to save Ukraine from herself, actually, from its own leadership. But unfortunately, it's not going to work because the cat is out of the box now, and for as long as Zelensky is going to be there, unless there's a major political and military defeat, that guy is going to keep choking Ukrainians until they die. Thank you very much, guys. See you next time. Have a nice one.